what is one piece of advice you would give them?
It's a little deep, Jordan, but I would encourage everybody, and this is something as a 43-year-old now in the photography industry for about 20 years that I'm finally realizing even more than ever the significance of, and that is learn to take a step back and establish what I call it a big picture view, what your big picture view is.
But yeah, Nathan, let's do this. And just so people can get a little bit of a background of stuff, we've gotten to work together quite a bit the past few years. You know, a couple years ago, I got to work on and talk on your show, Bokeh podcast. Got to talk a little bit about, you know, my philosophy when it comes to growing a wedding business. You recently, last January, got to come to our mastermind event with our students. Had a really awesome presentation as well. So people who maybe have not heard of you yet, you know, you're a former wedding photographer, built a really amazing company called Photographers Edit, Bokeh podcast, now the Noobie podcast for new photographers. You have a really awesome Noobie conference coming up. So just to get started with this, you know, tell us a little bit more on your journey, how this all happened. You're deep in the photography world. Well, how did you built these companies? What did that journey look like for you and everything?
To be honest, there was no intention, at least at the outset. I think it was almost like a subconscious rebellion to what my dad, maybe my parents in general, kind of wanted me to do as far as a career goes. And so I happened to have, this is back in 2000 or so, the year 2000, which is crazy. It's been a little while, but I had a consumer level SLR camera. This is, of course, back in the film days, so 35 millimeter film. And I happened to take a bunch of pictures. A few of them turned out pretty well. My partner at the time put together a portfolio of images for me. And somebody saw those and was like, hey, you should shoot my friend's wedding. And so I had the opportunity to photograph that first wedding. The funny story is I missed the kiss during the ceremony. Like this is my first wedding ceremony. I have no idea what I'm doing, and I've been reading a book or maybe a couple of books trying to figure out how to take pictures at a wedding. And I guess my timing was just off, and I'm using this cheap camera, and so I missed the kiss. Fortunately, the couple was super nice, and they literally let me set the shot back up on the stage. They brought the bridal party in, the pastor. They got back up there, posed for the whole picture. And when you look through their proof album afterwards, you'd never have known that we missed the kiss for that first event. That's how I got actually started in the photography industry.
That's awesome. That's awesome. It was kind of similar with me too. I remember that was a lot. My parents at the time, this was like 10 years ago when I thought I was going to be diving into the wedding industry and everything. Like they all wanted me to be like nurses, doctors. Like, what are you doing?
Exactly.
And I guess, you know, from becoming a wedding photographer, growing a successful wedding photography business through those years, how did diving into, you know, building Photographers Edit, building this awesome company to support photographers in that realm for like their editing services, building Bokeh podcast, how did that end up happening and everything as well? So
2007, 2008, I saw an opportunity. As a wedding photographer, I was shooting 30, 40 weddings a year, and transitioned from film to digital. So now we have this post-production process that we have to manage, you know, rather than just simply going to my nearby lab and dropping the film off and getting proofs back. Now these images had to be edited. And I had 2 young kids, and it was stressful to manage not only our workload, photographing 30, 40 weddings a year, but then also the post-production on top of that. And I also noticed in the industry at the time that there were a few post-production companies, but they hadn't been designed to scale effectively. So they had a waiting list. They were super expensive. Our kind of primary competitor was ultimately super complicated. You literally had to get a calculator out to add up and figure out how much this was going to cost. And it was like $600 to $800 just to have one wedding processed, which was not affordable for most photographers, right?
Exactly.
So I saw an opportunity to create a solution that I needed, but ultimately one that would be more readily available for a wider range of photographers in the industry, both because we would create it in such a way that it would scale more effectively, and also because the price point would be more affordable. And so 2008 is when I had the opportunity to launch Photographers Edit. So it's been about 14 years ago now. And I've been lucky enough to work with an incredible team over the years, and we've built that into a multi-million-dollar company. And,
That's awesome.
We're still actually on track right now to have our biggest year yet this year. So
heck yeah.
We've continued to see some lovely growth and opportunity in the industry.
That's super cool. That's super cool. And did Bokeh podcast kind of come up with Photographers Edit at the same time, or was that kind of something that came afterwards as well? What happened there?
I really enjoy connecting with photographers just in conversation. I mean, Jordan, you and I have had wonderful conversation over the years, and I've had the opportunity to connect with your community as well at the workshop in Florida. And this is just something that I've enjoyed, 20 years or so in the industry. And there was a point in my life personally where I was going through some stuff and I kind of disconnected from the industry, not necessarily intentionally, but it was just with everything that was going on. I wasn't connecting as readily with photographers and having those wonderful conversations that I love so much.
Exactly.
And so on a bit of a selfish level, at this point in my life, this is 2015, 2016, I had the opportunity to start a podcast, number one, as a means of just kind of reconnecting with the industry to have conversation.
Yeah.
The primary goal really at the end of the day with the Bokeh podcast is to, and by the way, I love that you say Bokeh because that is the correct pronunciation. It is a
what
Japanese.
Do most people say?
Well, Bokeh is what I call it. Only because I think because that's how most people pronounce it. It's just, in American culture anyway, that's kind of how we tend to pronounce it. It is a Japanese word. I grew up in Japan and the Japanese pronunciation is Bokeh. And so you're correct, it's Bokeh podcast. But I had the opportunity to start the podcast, and not only, again, was it a kind of a selfish outlet just to connect with photographers over conversation, but ultimately I wanted to be able to add value to the industry. Yeah. And while at the time kind of the popular thing was to have a blog, and that was a way of creating content and adding value to the industry, the podcast was a really great opportunity and avenue for me. So, and then there's, kind of this tertiary benefit, which is that it's a soft sell for Photographers Edit, but I talk about it so little on the show that I've literally had photographers tell me, like, Nate, you need to actually talk about Photographers Edit. And I've just have an apprehension with that because I've been in the industry so long that the last thing that I want is the experience that I've had on the other side of photographers with businesses where they're just kind of constantly selling their stuff, right? And I think that can be a turnoff a lot of times to people. So my primary focus is value, good conversation, and then if I have the opportunity to be able to share about Photographers Edit, then of course I'll take that opportunity. Take advantage of that opportunity as I can.
Yeah, I think that's super cool. And that's kind of partly why we started like this YouTube channel and everything, and like started doing these podcast episodes and everything as well, is because me also transitioning from wedding photography like to the WLMA, different world, different type of work. And I felt myself as I got deep into making sure students get results, but not having as many of these naturally having as many of these conversations, not being as like connected to that world before. And I've absolutely loved just, sipping wine, like with wedding photographers, maybe they're former students.
Cheers to you, by the way.
And all that. Yeah, absolutely. Cheers. And it's been super fun. Now, I wanted to bring up this a little bit as well, because you started a new podcast called the Noobie podcast, and you have a Noobie conference coming up as well, which sounds super cool. What is that's coming up also? Yeah,
I appreciate you asking. So we're in the process right now of building a new company, which we're going to be launching. We can't say a whole lot about it at the moment, but we're going to be launching this company in January. And much like the Bokeh podcast is a subsidiary area of Photographers Edit, the Noobie podcast, and then the conference as well, is going to be a subsidiary of this new company. So that's kind of the general thought process. But I also saw and had been considering for a bit the opportunity in the industry to launch a conference that addressed some of the shortcomings that I've noticed in the industry at conferences and workshops for years, particularly around the area of education. And how these conferences are approaching education, the quality of education, for that matter, even the quality of the speakers. Because a lot of times you have talented photographers, maybe even extremely talented business people who have the numbers that they can back up what they're saying with, but they're not necessarily teachers. And that's not their fault per se, but at the end of the day, if people are going to spend hundreds or even thousands of dollars to attend a conference, and you sit down to a photographer who, again, may be super talented in their own right, but they're not teachers, the quality of education is lacking, and many of, not even some cases, in most scenarios. And so what I wanted to do is to create a conference that would address the issues with education at some of the conferences that I've been to over the years. And initially, we were going to do that under the Bokeh brand, the Bokeh podcast brand. But it made more sense ultimately to create this conference and podcast that are focused specifically on new photographers, because it will ultimately better fit with this new company that we're launching. So we have the Noobie podcast, as you mentioned, noobiepodcast.com for anybody who's curious. And of course, you can find it, Noobie, on any podcast player as well that you might use. But that is, generally speaking, about 20-minute episodes geared towards simplifying photography and photography business for new photography business owners or new photographers. So let's just call it within the first 3 years or so of business. This is the podcast, and then ultimately the conference as well. Noobieconference.com. It's a conference for them as well. It's geared specifically to new photographers and really trying to help simplify the onboarding of the most important elements of running a photography business as a new photographer. Because, I mean, you've experienced this, Jordan. You go to some conferences or workshops and there's a myriad of information and classes to take in, but it's not necessarily geared specifically to new photographers. And so we've created that in this case.
That's awesome. That's awesome. I'm going to put that link in the description of this YouTube video as well. I have more questions afterwards because I'm still very curious, and I'll ask some of those in the end. But I know you have an abundance of knowledge for us and a lot of the people watching the show right now. So let's dive into some of that.
Absolutely. Glad to.
So early in your career as a wedding photographer, personally for you, what were some of the biggest struggles that kept you from growing, that you can look back now and you're like, man, I wish I would have known different? What were you trying to do to grow your business that didn't really work at that time?
Well, I will say, fortunately, we were super lucky. And it was, and again, I'll set the premise for this, which is that it was kind of naive behavior. I didn't go to school for business. I didn't study marketing. But at the time, this is, again, around 2001 or so, here in the Chattanooga, Tennessee market. So as you know, of course, Jordan, but some of the listeners may not. It's a relatively small market, certainly a conservative market. And so at the time, what was most commonplace, and I was a wedding photographer, what was most commonplace in wedding photography was this kind of stiff, uber-posed style of wedding photography, very traditional in nature, usually mostly, if not all color, a lot of times shot on medium format film. And meanwhile, as we were getting into wedding photography, we were paying attention to what was at the time termed as photojournalistic wedding photography coming out of the West Coast. And so we noticed that, we started paying attention to that. And long story short, what we decided to do was to bring that style of wedding photography to the Chattanooga market. Now, again, we didn't have the training. I say we, this is my business partner at the time. We didn't have the training in marketing and business to know that we should create a distinct brand position and position ourselves against the market. But we just saw something that we wanted to do stylistically as photographers. But ultimately, we also knew that really nobody else was doing it. And so it seemed like a cool opportunity to be able to do something different. So that's exactly what we did. So to answer your question, as far as, I guess, where we made mistakes, fortunately, as far as getting the business off the ground and having limited growth, there were minimal mistakes there. And we got kind of lucky because we just were trying to do this thing that we thought was cool, and it worked out well because it helped us stand out. But to go back to your first question, which is, where did we fall short? I would still say my biggest shortcoming in my years as a photography business owner had to do with awareness with numbers. And this was the case both on a financial level, but also just on a data level. We'll talk about SEO and web analytics, particularly though with the financial game. I didn't know. I didn't have any training again, number one. And I grew up in a family that didn't have a lot of money, so I wasn't super fluent in the language of money. And so as we started to continue to build this business, and we were starting to get, sometimes, it started, of course, with $100 checks or $300 checks, that kind of thing. But when that started to grow into the thousands, I didn't know what it meant to handle that kind of money. And so, of course, there's this natural excitement, and you get to put that in the bank and see the numbers grow. But then I'm not proactively thinking about setting aside money for taxes, and then how do you pay your taxes? And then when we started using QuickBooks and started working with an accountant, even then I wasn't paying attention to, we'll just call it a profit and loss statement, the income, the expenses, and beginning to develop an intelligent awareness about what was happening in my business as far as numbers go, and making adjustments as needed. this type of awareness and ultimately proactive behavior around financial management was really my biggest shortcoming. And we had the fortunate success of building on, a basic level. When I say basic level, just looking at income, an incredible business as a wedding photography brand. But had we been more proactive in managing the finances at the time, and ultimately been more proactive in reaching out for help with regards to managing our finances, I can only imagine where I'd be now. I'm super lucky to be where I am now financially in life, but to think about where I'd be now, had I done that back then, I would say that's the biggest shortcoming, and ultimately the biggest encouragement I would give to photographers, especially those that are new in the game, to be super, super proactive in learning how to proactively really manage your finances and ultimately develop an awareness around numbers.
I hear you on that, because you talking about this now reminds me of after my first good year in the wedding industry, and dealing with like taxes really like for the first time, it screwed me over pretty much. Right? It screwed me over that year. I had no clue what I was doing. All these new like papers that I'm freaking out about that I'm being sent from the IRS, and like figuring out how to handle that type of stuff, not realizing I had to budget, for taxes for that coming year and everything, was an absolute headache.
Yeah. Well, the funny thing is, most of it is not all that complicated, right? And this was part of my problem. Is I would build it up in my head, whether it was as simple as paying monthly sales tax or ultimately taking care of income tax. I would build it up in my head and make it a bigger deal than it really, in the end, actually was. If I had just been ultimately carrying out some simple habits of, as we talked about, setting aside the money necessary for, of course, the sales tax, but then ultimately income tax payments, it really wouldn't have been that big of a deal. But one, I, again, lacked education. And then two, I kind of succumbed to the fear and the apprehension and the stress around money. And ultimately, instead of going and addressing it head on, I kind of shied away from it. And that's the last thing that you need to do, especially when it comes to paying taxes. And so I that ultimately caused a lot of stress and headache, as you mentioned as well. And had I just simply leveraged not only the tools, but ultimately the resources around me, saying to an accountant, hey, can you just help me? I need to do this, 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 and this. Can you help me get all this set up and in order? My life would have been way easier and certainly less stressful. But I tended to shy away from that. And that's what really got to me in the end.
So a big part of like getting over that was actually seeking that help from the accountants and really just helping get things in order in that area, correct? Part of it was that, and fortunately I've had the opportunity to work with an accountant locally now for, I don't know, probably between 12 and 14 years, maybe even more than that. And it felt so nice to be able to find somebody who was empathetic and really kind and ultimately willing to help me understand and ultimately work through, manage all of this. So that made a big difference for sure. But the other thing too is just really it comes down to one, and I hesitate to say fear because it's such a first world thing, right? Like we're afraid of money. But I had no education, and my experience with money personally had been a pretty stressful one. And so again, rather than addressing that head on and trying to figure out what was at the root of that and addressing the behavioral issues and then ultimately changing those behaviors, I just kind of avoided it. So once I decided to face those issues head on and actually begin to address them, address my behavior, that's really where the change started to happen. And I was fortunate enough as well, as my company grew, I started to be able to make more money. And that's always helpful. But at the end of the day, I can't encourage photographers enough, especially those that are just getting started, to be extremely proactive. Number one, putting in place something like QuickBooks Online, which, by the way, is way more user-friendly now than what it used to be 20 years ago with CDs, DVDs, and clicking on the software. And like, it's so user-friendly now. So getting started with that for like $20, $30 a month, and then reaching out to your local accountant, sitting down with them, and just laying out a game plan for the year. And for the sake of taxes, but then also asking them for help if you need it to learn how to proactively look at the numbers, income, expenses, looking where there are shortcomings in both regards, and how you can ultimately continue to improve and build your business for the long run. Love that. Love that. Now, when it came to the point where, where you're maybe struggling to actually get leads and clients, and then you're starting to really figure out what was working for you to get leads and clients, and start getting more of those bookings as well. What would you say were some of those key strategies that helped you propel the business forward?
I've realized more in the last 6 months than ever the significance of the kind of 80-20 principle, right? Where it's 20% of the efforts, assuming they're intelligent efforts, result in 80% or give you 80% of the results, right? So not only in life but in business, what I've found is that it's usually the simple principles applied consistently and well that do the heavy lifting and ultimately bring the best results. And I would say, to answer your question, Jordan, that in that regard, or to that regard, that one, even though we didn't realize what we were doing at the time, the clear and distinct brand position that we had as a photography business, which was, ultimately this kind of, at the time, what would have been considered modern, quote unquote, modern wedding photography, but a photojournalistic style of wedding photography. It was very unique to the Chattanooga market. And I also happened to, this is kind of a bonus, but I happened to be photographing with my partner at the time. So it was 2 photographers showing up to photograph the wedding, which was at the time not the norm. Now it's very commonplace all over the industry, right? But that was also an unusual thing and ultimately gave us a leg up. So that was really cool. And then the other thing I would say, and again, back to my original point, which is that most of what makes the biggest difference in business is not necessarily earth-shattering, relationships. Developing relationships in the industry, and ultimately in particular with it's kind of started with the florist, but ultimately with a coordinator. Developing relationships with key vendors as wedding photographers can make all the difference in the world, because for a couple of reasons. So one, they can potentially grow with you, right? So if you're in a particular point in your photography business where maybe, let's just say for the sake of the conversation, you're charging $1,000 for a wedding, but you want to go to 2, or maybe you've gone to 3, that coordinator can funnel the right clients to you based on where you're at. They know what you're charging. They can send you the right clients. So that's helpful. But then ultimately being able to, I guess, it enables you to scale effectively because you're working with somebody who is actively booking clients as well. So as they continue to meet with clients, they're able to send you business. And we developed relationships with Taylor Monin and her crew here when she was a coordinator in the area. And as a result, booked thousands and thousands of dollars worth of weddings. And we had such a great relationship that Taylor would actually come to our office, bring clients to our office to meet with us. And I could literally just sit back and Taylor would sell us for me. I mean, I didn't even have to do the work. It was the craziest thing. And an ideal world. And I still have to say thank you to Taylor for that. It was absolutely amazing. But that's the kind of relationship. And it's idealistic, I'm sure, and maybe a bit of an exception to the rule. But we want to actively work to develop these relationships. And I had a big caveat, and then I'll stop, Jordan. But the big caveat, and this is one I want everybody to key into, is that the relationship was a genuine relationship. I.e., I'm not just going up to Taylor and handing a business card and saying I'd like to work together. There is an ongoing effort at, first of all, genuine interaction, as in I genuinely am interested in you. I genuinely care about you. There is genuine effort to add value to Taylor and her family's life, as in my partner was doing family sessions for them. And so we're not just there to get something from Taylor. That's not the kind of working relationship that we had, but we genuinely wanted to connect with Taylor. And I would like to think anyway that that's one of the reasons we had such a great relationship and ultimately made such a big impact on her and why she was sending work to us, because not only did we do good work, but ultimately we had a good relationship as well.
Love that. Love that. So number one, it seemed like when it came to brand, seeing what everyone else in your market was doing, finding something that worked that was actually headed the other direction,
correct,
kind of a thing, which was absolutely key. And that kind of happened with me too when I was shooting weddings. Not maybe as dramatic at the time, but a big part of what I would do is, like, in my marketing, I'd always give extremely detailed, like, posing tips, which a lot of people weren't doing at that time as well. Very detailed posing tips. Literally the stuff that I learned from, like, one of my mentors at the time. I'd have couples meet with me at engagement sessions. They're like, yeah, we read your emails, like the marketing emails. We brought all the posing tips here. And like 99% of the couples would work with me purely because of those emails.
That's really cool.
Absolutely. And then two, relationship marketing, especially when it comes to vendors, and to be able to build those relationships by being able to give. See what, in a way, pretty much help them see that they can get something out of this relationship as well, and just kind of build and grow together and everything.
I know it's harder to do as you continue to develop more and more relationships.
Yeah.
and this is a little bit risky, but something that I would at least suggest considering for those listening in is to maybe hone in on, say, 3 or 4 particular relationships that intelligently you see an opportunity to result that those relationships will result in business. I mean, you can be very honest with this person and say, "Hey, look, I'd love the opportunity to work with you, but I want to make sure I'm adding value as well," and then continue that conversation about value. But ultimately, I'm here for business, so I'm going to pay attention to the people that can actually bring me business. That's absolutely important. We can't minimize that, but for the sake of actually investing genuinely in these individuals, i.e., offering to do headshots for them when they're updating their website, offering to do portrait sessions for their family, whatever it might be, looking for opportunities to add value to their life. You can only do that with so many people, right? And
exactly.
If we're going to actually invest, the thing that I think is one of the things most important is when I'm having a conversation with you, I'm making eye contact, I'm paying attention, I'm curious, I'm asking follow-up questions. I'm invested emotionally in individual conversations and in the relationship. Most people shy away from that for one reason or another. And one of the reasons, potentially, whether it's conscious or subconscious, is that we can only do that so many times, day in and day out. We have personal relationships, we have business relationships, and we can only give so much. And I get that. So maybe focus in on 3 or 4 key relationships and truly develop those out so you can really bring something to those relationships that's impactful. I just can't recommend that enough. I've been to way too many networking meetings, Jordan, where it feels so superficial and fake. And I just don't have time. I haven't had time for that in my life for a long time, but especially now in my life, I don't have time for that. I don't want to go hand a business card and put on a fake smile and say, please, look at my website or whatever we say at networking meetings now. I want to really connect with somebody. And I just encourage everybody to do the same thing. That's
gold. That's gold. Absolutely love that. Now, getting a feel of this as well, because you've literally talked to hundreds, possibly even like thousands of photographers, not only growing your successful businesses, gained a bunch of knowledge from other photographers all over the world, through your podcast and everything as well. Well-versed just in the entrepreneurial and growing and scaling businesses. So if you were to go back in time with the knowledge that you have now, what are maybe 3 to 5 steps you would do if you were to grow your wedding photography business all over again? What would that kind of look like for you?
Man, that's good. Okay, so there's some of the things that I did that I would do again because it works. But then, I've also learned from that experience. So I would say, number 1, create a distinct brand position. And I know that we've kind of touched on this multiple times in this conversation now, but for photographers listening in, whether you've got an established business or you're just getting started, it is a busy marketplace out there. And I would venture that it's only going to continue to get busier, right? With technology, it's so easy for somebody to get into photography and photograph on the weekends or do it full time, whatever the case may be. It's a noisy marketplace. If you want to stand out, one of the key ways to stand out, it's not the only one, but it's one of the key ways that's not discussed enough, is to create a clear and distinct brand position that enables you to be able to very clearly and succinctly in 3 seconds, whether somebody's reading on the homepage of your website or they're talking to you, you can communicate in a very simple phrase what you offer and how that service offering is different from the other photographers in your marketplace that are offering something comparable. If I just say I'm a wedding photographer, that doesn't differentiate me, right? If I say that I'm Chattanooga's black and white wedding photographer, now I begin to differentiate myself because I'm saying I only photograph in black and white. And that is going to be a differentiating factor. If I say I'm Chattanooga's black and white wedding photographer for skateboarders, now I've niched down even more, and I'm creating a distinct brand position and a very distinct target market, right? So those are just some simple examples, but I cannot recommend this enough. It's going to do a couple of things. One, it will help you in your marketing efforts stand out. But the interesting kind of additional benefit is that it will also help photographers focus their efforts, intention, and energy when it comes to building their business. They're not trying to do 68 different things. They're focused on their brand position, and everything that they do on a day-to-day basis should be supporting that. So that'd be the first thing. I would do it intentionally with awareness now. I got lucky when I first started. So that'd be the first thing. Number 2 would be to, as we just discussed, to continue to add incredible amounts of value to key business relationships as much as possible. I won't rehash everything that we just said. I just can't recommend enough. Number 3 would be, and just looking back at my career as a wedding photographer, I shot for about a decade. I would say faster turnaround time with images. Even when we went to digital, I want to say that our turnaround time at the time may have been in the realm of 4 weeks, 3 to 4 weeks, somewhere in that, maybe a little bit more even. I think our contract maybe said 6 weeks. I would now, especially with all the technology and services available, including Photographers Edit, I would want to turn them around in a week. And really, if I've got my systems in place and my work week organized really well, there's not a whole lot of reason not to be able to do something like that. So that would be the third thing, faster turnaround time with finished images. Number 4, and we touched on this a little bit, but proactive data management. And that sounds super nerdy, but what it really just means on a very simple level is to learn how to start paying attention to customer behavior. Yeah. And you want to be able to connect, whether it's Google Analytics, there are some other services as well that are comparable, to watch your customer or potential customers' behavior as it relates to your website, certainly the analytics associated with your social media, but begin to pay attention and make intelligent decisions based on that data that you're seeing. Super important. Number 5, proactive financial management. Again, we touched on that already. I'll just sum it up by saying not only, of course, take care of your taxes, that should be a given, and set aside the money as you need to so that when it comes time to make those payments, whether it's sales tax or income tax, you can do it without even having to think about it. Keep it simple. But ultimately, as we talked about earlier, utilizing the numbers to make smarter decisions. Looking at that profit and loss statement. If those of you listening and don't know what a profit and loss statement, not a big deal. But learn what that is. Do a quick Google search. Learn what it is. And then if you're not signed up for something like QuickBooks that has a really easy-to-use profit and loss statement that you can go and look at, do that and begin to look at that information. If you need help with that, go to your accountant and say, hey, I need help understanding what this means and ultimately how to make intelligent decisions for the sake of my business based on these numbers. And I think that's really important. The last thing, and this is kind of a bonus because I'm still on the fence with this one, but I know that I lost a lot of money actually not doing in-person sales, IPS. And so in hindsight, if I wanted to add another, probably easily, 30, 40, 50K, maybe even more. I know some photographers just do crazy, insane sales, even with one client. IPS would be somewhere that I would go. We intentionally did not do that at the time. And this is really why I'm on the fence still about it, because we wanted a more free-form, kind of flexible workflow. We didn't want to spend the additional time. We worked with a gallery at the time that kind of sold our images for us, sold prints for us, and kind of did that so-called heavy lifting for us. And we just didn't really think about it. We charged a premium up front, and we weren't worried about getting the additional print sales in the back end. But I know as a business owner, again, somebody who's more aware of numbers now, that would be something that I would at least have to seriously consider.
Yeah, I hear you on that. And one thing I absolutely love that you said is us really paying attention to the data. And for me, like one of my passions is like paid traffic. I absolutely love paid traffic. It's how I grew my wedding business, even how we run like the WLMA like right now. And I always tell like our students in the WLMA, because that's a huge thing that we teach, where it's like, if you're running these ads and you're not having that spreadsheet of the profit loss, writing down every single number every single day, you're literally running your ads blind, and that's dangerous.
It's so true. It's so true. But I think, and I'm going to play devil's advocate because I was one of these people, right? I think a lot of photographers would say, well, I'm not a numbers person. I'm an artist. I'm passionate about my art. That's what I'm going to focus on. So the idea of focusing on numbers, it doesn't make sense to me. Workflow, designing workflow and efficient workflows doesn't make sense to me. I'm a passionate artist. That's what matters to me. The cool thing is if you were willing to spend a little bit of time, and a little bit of time in the context of running a business, it may be a few days worth of time. Maybe it's a few hours at the very least. But spending a little bit of time investing in learning at least the basics as it relates to these numbers that we're talking about, as it relates
100%.
to workflow, it will translate a million times over to not only a better life, but ultimately more freedom to do the very thing that these photographers will say they want to focus on, which is photography.
Exactly.
Right? So if you just put a little bit of time into these things, it will not only help you build your business, but it'll ultimately give you the flexibility to spend time on what you want to.
Exactly. 100% agree. Now, I know we've hit this topic a couple times, but I want to go a little bit deeper because I believe this is so important. And a lot of people, even when they hear it, they get it. They surface level get branding, but they don't know how to like create that for themselves, how to find that for themselves as well. So, you recently came to our WLMA Mastermind event with our students in Florida. Absolutely amazing presentation on brand position. Going a little bit deeper, what does that mean? Why is it important? And how should photographers go about even figuring that out for themselves?
Yeah, branding is an interesting kind of this umbrella term, right? And different people, I think, kind of perceive it differently. They're thinking about the logo, they're thinking about their colors, they're thinking about their photographs. I mean, so many different things kind of get lumped under that word. But when we're talking about brand position or brand positioning, what we're talking about very simply is just the value proposition that we are offering to our marketplace. So what does that mean on a super practical level? I offer wedding photography. Somebody is looking for wedding photography. That means that I have a value proposition. I have something of value that I can offer to them. That is my brand position. By the way, our brand position can be intentional or it cannot be intentional, right? We have essentially created a brand position for ourselves even if we don't want to. That position may absolutely suck. That brand position may be super vague or nebulous, but we've got one nonetheless. A good brand position is both clear and distinct, right? So it's easy to understand. I don't need to listen to you explain it for 5 minutes. And it is distinct in that there is literally nobody else saying and ultimately offering this particular version of the service. So that's the basic definition.
Love that. Love that. So one, I love that you mentioned that as well, because sometimes people may be like, oh, I don't really want to think about brand position, but it's like you already have a brand position, whether you like it or not. You need to figure it out because you could just be in a really horrible brand position right now. And so it should be something where pretty much if someone went on your website with the wording and maybe what's visually there, not visual and non-visual aspects, it should be pretty clear and pretty easy to find out like that, correct?
Well, it should be, yes. And if somebody's even questioning the value of this, imagine a crowd of 1,000 people. You know, we see it's like if you picture I don't know, one of these big music festivals, for example, and you think about the throngs, the thousands and thousands of people, and imagine everybody is wearing blue. Let's say everybody's wearing blue, and if you, as a photographer, are not intentionally distinguishing yourself with a unique brand position and then following through on that, you are also going to be wearing blue, and that throng of thousands of people wearing blue. If you have done a good job creating a clear and distinct brand position, you will now be wearing red in that throng of blue. And what does that mean? You stand out more readily. It's 1,000 people. So yeah, you're not necessarily going to be picked out right away, but ultimately you're going to be easier to find. You will stand out in the masses. And if we've not created that distinct brand position, there's a good chance you're going to get lost in the masses. You may be able to build a business. You're not going to be able to build it as easily or as readily. And so that's something to be considered. It really can't be minimized.
Yeah, that's a perfect way to describe that. Love that. Love that. Now, we had so much value in this as well. This is one question I like to end with people on the show. So if there was one piece of thing that I can remember off the bat, it's right here. So for photographers that are struggling out there, what is one piece of advice you would give them?
It's a little deep, Jordan, but I would encourage everybody, and this is something as a 43-year-old now in the photography industry for about 20 years that I'm finally realizing even more than ever the significance of, and that is learn to take a step back and establish what I call it a big picture view, what your big picture view is. It's very easy, and I'm guilty of this. I described earlier how I got into the photography industry. It was just kind of haphazard nature. I thought photography is cool and I don't want to do this other stuff, so I'll go buy a fancy camera. And I just got lucky and somebody saw my work and I started shooting and then ultimately built a business from it. But it was very unintentional, right? It was very haphazard in nature. And that's how a lot of photographers get in. And by the way, no judgment. There's nothing wrong with that. But it also kind of minimizes the potential for greatness, certainly, but even just building a sustainable business that will continue to grow over the long run. In order to do that more effectively and ultimately to create a really great, clear and distinct brand position and to continue to book clients and grow the business, you really need to establish a big picture view. What that is on a very simple level, Jordan, I'll just sum it up, is that big picture view, it's made up of, as I define it, financial goals and then ultimately time goals as well. Because I can say, hey, I want to make 500 grand a year, but if I'm spending 80 hours a week making that 500 grand, it's pointless, right?
Yeah.
So I want to be very clear about what it is that I need to make to pay the bills, and then what I want to make to save, to go on vacation, etc. Those are my financial goals. And of course, I have those maybe for the next year, but I also have them for the next 5 years, 10 years. Those are my financial goals. But then I also want to be clear about how much time I'm willing to spend, on average anyway, each week, making that kind of money. Those goals will then help me decide the business model, the service that I offer, the target market that I go after, as a result, the price that I'm able to charge. It'll make things a lot clearer when it comes to building and then running a business. And ultimately, I mean, the time that I'm spending, how I'm spending my time. We talked earlier about how brand position will help determine how we spend our time day to day in building and running our business. All of these things are determined at kind of the base level by this concept called a big picture view. Julie Morgenstern wrote a book called Time Management from the Inside Out. She said that the most successful people in life have a big picture view that enables them to rise above the chaos and maintain their perspective. Yeah. And it's a super powerful statement that really beautifully sums up where I think a lot of photographers are. We're in this kind of chaotic world right now. I mean, generally speaking, but ultimately, when it comes to the photography industry, there's a lot of chaos and noise out there. And maybe we even feel that way individually in our business. If we're willing to take a step back and establish what our big picture view is, and then ultimately let that drive our behavior, the business model, and the way that we're running our business day to day, will establish not only clarity, but I would venture that in most, if not all cases, will ultimately develop a successful business as a result. But we just have to start with that intention. It makes all the difference in the world.
Love that. Love that. That was awesome. And where can we find you? And for people interested in coming to the Noobie conference as well, what are some of the details on that also?
Yeah, I appreciate you asking. For everything that I'm involved in, if you just go to Nathan Holritz, NathanHolritz.com, you can find me there, and then ultimately link to social and connect with me. The Noobie conference is just noobieconference.com. So it's Noobie conference.com. The conference is January 10th and 11th of 2023, so coming up here in the next 3 months or so.
Awesome.
In Chattanooga, Tennessee. And for more information, more details, and kind of learning about our unique conference model, everybody can go to noobieconference.com.
Awesome. Awesome. I'm excited. Super excited. And excited to see you in March as well.
Absolutely.
It's going to be a lot of fun. But thank you so much, Nathan. So much awesome value in here. I'm going to add all those links in the description of this YouTube video, but I appreciate your time.
No, it's been my privilege, truly.